Whoa! That just happened again. Hey everybody! A good Shabbos to you. That was of Rumi Strauss and his band doing a medley of Karl Bach tunes for Shabbos. Good Shabbos, everybody. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. Very excited to be with you on this fine Friday as we're getting ready for Shabbos tonight. Who's with us today? Yehudit Sobel from Florence, South Carolina. Sharon from Lebanon, New Jersey. Mark from Utah. Tom says Shabbat Shalom. Spencer from West Hartford, Connecticut. Iba Basket from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I don't think I've seen your name before. Welcome, welcome. If this is your first time tuning in, let us know so we can welcome you. Annie with us, saying hello to AT community friends. Patrice from St. George. Delana from Texas. Hannah Rivka says Shabbat Shalom. Jerry from Boise, Idaho. Melissa from Great Neck, New York. Chaim is from Charlotte. Pam is with us from Nashville. And Joe is with us from Cali. Welcome, everybody. It's so good to have you here. And over there on the YouTube side, Mirasia Janut is with us saying Shabbat Shalom. All right. First timer, Eric Jerome from Omaha, Nebraska. Welcome, Eric. And Bonnie Moore as well. Also, Leah and Lisa. Welcome, my friends. All right. We were not together yesterday. We did the double daf on Wednesday because I was out of the city yesterday evening. So great to be back with you all together, getting our worldwide learning community together as we're preparing for Shabbos. Today's daf is very interesting. It's going to have two conversations among the sages trying to figure out a law of Eruvin. And let's see if we can figure out what is the underlying principle that's really going underneath this discussion of what exactly is the law, right? So we understand, especially if you're a first timer, we're in Tractate Eruvin. Oh, so where are we holding? We're in chapter 6, discussing the 6th Mishna of the 3rd volume of the Talmud. That's Tractate Eruvin. And we're on Daf 74, page 74 of the 3rd volume of the Talmud. Generally speaking, this is Tractate Eruvin, and we're discussing how we adjust our surroundings on Shabbos so that we can delight in Shabbos. And one of the things that might keep us from delighting in Shabbos is that we can't carry objects from a private domain out to a public domain on Shabbos. That's prohibited at a Torah level. But we had a decree that was made in the time of King Solomon that even one who lives in a house in a courtyard, so the house is certainly a private domain, and the courtyard of his house is a private domain, but if two or more houses share a courtyard, then it's like there's multiple people who have a right to walk around in that courtyard. And if we carry an object from our house into such a shared courtyard, it has a little bit of the flavor of carrying from a private domain to a public domain. And so the sages prohibited that unless the residents of that courtyard join in an Eruv, meaning that each of the houses represented in that courtyard, the owner is enough, his family members don't have to do it separately, but that each house in the courtyard contributes a little bit of food to the Eruv, to a kind of joint basket of food, which is going to be stored in one of the houses of the courtyard. Two courtyards that adjoin each other could also join together in a kind of larger Eruv so that people could carry not only from their house into their own courtyard, but between the courtyards. And then we also saw, and this is how we opened the discussion of Eruv in this tractate, because the sages never start like sort of at the logical beginning of a subject, but the way that the tractates of the Talmud are organized is in a way that was interesting to the sages who knew the whole oral tradition. And what was interesting for them was to start with a kind of, interesting question in the middle of their learning, right? And then we just go in with that question, and then in order to unpack what's involved in solving that question, they would bring in, teachings from all different sages of different periods. So we never have this kind of organized, first we learn the basics, then we learn the easy questions, then we learn the tough questions. It's not really organized that way. But as we've seen, if you've got multiple courtyards that open into an alleyway, and that was a very kind of common living arrangement in the cities of the Talmudic period, that people essentially lived in a nice cul-de-sac, right? It was like an alley that had several courtyards opening into the alley, and then the alley would open out into the real public domain of the city. So if they wanted it to be possible to carry objects on Shabbos, not only from their house into their own courtyard or into the neighboring courtyard, but through this alleyway into the nearby courtyards, so then they would have to make an adjustment. One part of it was they would have a kind of larger Eruv where each of the courtyards would contribute to this basket of food, and they would keep it in one of the courtyards. But also, since this alleyway is now going to be designated as a place where all of the residents of the courtyards that open into it can carry there on Shabbos, the sages also decreed, and this is where our tractate began 73 pages ago, they also decreed that you have to mark that alley with either a side post at its opening, where the alleyway opens into the rest of the city, the public domain of the city, either a side post at that opening or a cross beam above. Okay, that's generally the subjects that we've been talking about. And today we're going to have these two discussions which have to do with an alleyway and what is going to be required, sort of minimum requirements, so that alleyway can become a place where people can carry on Shabbos. At least the residents of that courtyard can carry on Shabbos. So there's going to be some technical requirements here, but what I want us to think about is, what are the sages really getting at when they make these rulings? And particularly, I want to focus on two ideas. One is, when the sages when later sages are trying to figure out what earlier sages intended, what kinds of clues are they looking for in the rulings of those earlier sages? And why does it matter? Isn't it enough to know what the ruling is? Why do we need to know what the intent of the earlier sage who made that ruling is? Recently we had these Supreme Court hearings in the Senate where the senators here in America have been questioning this candidate to be confirmed as a new Supreme Court justice. And one of the questions that keeps coming up is, does it matter what the framers of the Constitution intended when they wrote the Constitution? And does it matter whether what later legislators were thinking when they established laws that were passed in the legislature? Does it matter what they intended, or do we just look at the law as written? Certainly it mattered to the sages, what the earlier sages intended. And here, one thing that's very important to understand is this was very much an oral tradition. Even though there was the first compilation where some of it was written down when the Mishna was compiled around the year 200 of the Common Era. Okay, so then some of it was written down, but really like a very shorthand version, almost a coded version of this much larger oral tradition was written down just so that it wouldn't be forgotten, because there's a real fear in the Roman oppression that so many of these laws would be lost if all the sages were murdered by the Romans. Thank God they weren't. But that was the first impetus to write down some of the oral tradition. And then about 300 years later, the sages of the Talmud wrote down the first commentary on the Mishnah, and that became the nucleus of the Talmud. Over the centuries, more and more commentary is added to it. But essentially, the Mishnah plus the Gemara equals the Talmud. So the Mishnah written down around the year 200, the Gemara set down about the year 500. The Mishnah in Hebrew, the Gemara in Aramaic, because that was the common language of the time and place. But But why did it matter so much to the sages what earlier sages were thinking about, what their intent was when they established a law? Because it's an oral tradition, right? So much of it is an oral tradition designed to be passed down from teachers to student, not only with the laws and the rulings themselves, but also the process by which each law was arrived at. That was very important because over time, new situations come up that earlier sages couldn't have imagined. The technology changes, the sort of geopolitics changes, there's new devices, new ways of living, new locations for living, new realities on the ground. And if they couldn't understand how the earlier sages arrived at their rulings, it'd be much harder to apply those rulings in modern times, as it were. The second thing we should look at as we discuss these discussions of the sages is when do they rule narrowly and when do they rule broadly, right? It's very important. Like, you have a ruling, and you could say, okay, well, that ruling is going to apply in this new situation that they couldn't have imagined but exists now, and we have to figure out what to do. We need an answer. What should people do in that situation? And when we look at that earlier ruling, one of the questions is, okay, what did the sages intend? How did they arrive at this? What situation were they trying to address that maybe isn't spelled out in their ruling? And also, did they rule narrowly, really for that specific situation, or was it a more broad ruling that we would be entitled to extend it to situations that are fairly different but just seem to have a related principle involved? Okay, so what was the sages' intent in their earlier rulings, and were they going narrow or broad? Okay, so Rav said that a mavoy, meaning an alleyway, right? So an alleyway that different courtyards, residential courtyards, open into. He said that a mavoy, an alleyway, cannot become permitted for carrying in the alleyway unless courtyards and houses open into it. Now, here what matters is he's not saying, the sages are always being very precise with their speech. So when he says courtyards and alleyways open into it, courtyards and houses open into it, this has a very specific meaning. It means that there's two or more courtyards and that each of those courtyards has two or more houses in it. If we don't have that situation, according to Rav, if there's only one courtyard, let's say, that opens into this alleyway, then the alleyway is not going to become permitted for carrying on Shabbos. They're not going to be able to make that adjustment, even if they, put food in a basket and put the crossbeam at the end of the alley. According to Rav, in order for an alleyway to become a place that it's permitted to carry objects on Shabbos, there has to be at least two courtyards or more that open into that alleyway. And in each of the courtyards, there has to be at least two houses or more that open into it. Shmuel argues with Rav and says, actually, one house and one courtyard is enough. And to be precise, when Shmuel says one house and one courtyard, this means even a house that doesn't have a courtyard, right? But there's a house like right on the alleyway. It doesn't have its own courtyard surrounding it that then opens into the alleyway. The house is on the alleyway. And one courtyard that even if it only has one house in it. This is much less demanding than Rav's ruling. This means that there's going to be more alleyways in whatever city we're talking about, where it's going to become possible to adjust them. It's not that they automatically become permitted for carrying, but it's even possible now if we collect the Eruvin in the basket of food and we mark the end of the alley, then even if there's only one house on the alley and one courtyard that opens into the alley, and that courtyard only has one house in it, it's going to be enough to permit carrying there when we adjust the alleyway. And Rabbi Yochanan goes even further with his permission. And remember that the laws of Eruv are all by decree of the rabbis. And that's why this whole body of law tends to be much more lenient than other areas of the law, where there's more, where it's based on Torah restrictions. Generally speaking, rabbinic decrees are there to prevent us from coming to violate by mistake a Torah law. It's a fence around the Torah to prevent us from transgressing a Torah law. But the law of Eruv is a large body of law based on that original ruling in King Solomon's time, that you can't carry, in your own private courtyard if it has multiple houses in it. So already that's a rabbinic decree. And when we go further than that and go into alleyways and other courtyards and multiple houses or not multiple houses, lest we start making decrees upon decrees, in other words, extra decrees, not so that we don't violate a Torah law, but so that we don't violate another rabbinic decree, and the decrees could really start multiplying. The rabbis are going to be much more lenient in this area. So Rabbi Yochanan says, even if there's just one ruin in the alleyway and one courtyard that only has one house in it, that's going to be enough to make it for that alleyway to have the potential to be adjusted so that we can carry in it. That's a very permissive ruling. Here we now have when there was one house and one courtyard, and that courtyard had a house in it. Okay, well, so there was at least two residences in this alleyway, and those people would need to come together to adjust the alleyway so that they could carry there. But now Rabbi Yochanan is saying, even if it's just a ruin, right, like a house that fell apart and no one lives there anymore, and one courtyard that has a house in it, now there's only potentially one family living in this whole alleyway. Rav would certainly not permit that. Shmuel would not permit that. But Rabbi Yochanan does. Why? Because the ruin, even though people don't live there now, it is the ruin of a residence, right? It's suitable for someone to live there, even though no one is living there now. And as we've learned earlier, what is a ruin that amounts to the level of a residence? I think it has to have 3 walls. It doesn't even have to have a roof, right? But you could fix it up. It's a fixer-upper, right? That ruin is a fixer-upper. So even if no one lives there now, it has the potential to become a residence. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, last week we learned a lot about Rav Yosef and what an amazing person he was, who just happened to be blind, but had this enormous encyclopedic memory, and just had the whole tradition memorized, and you could really go to him to understand earlier rulings. Later in his life, Rav Yosef became ill and forgot much of his encyclopedic knowledge, but his student Abaye was so good at sort of learning from Rav Yosef that he was able to remind Rav Yosef of everything that Rav Yosef had taught earlier in his life. At any rate, here, it seems like when Rav Yosef is before his illness, when his knowledge is super strong. And Abaye says to Rav Yosef, Did Rabbi Yochanan say, not did he say that a ruin and a courtyard are enough? Abaye is going to go even further. He says, is it true that Rabbi Yochanan said that even a vineyard path and a courtyard would be enough to make an alleyway, have the potential to adjust it so that carrying would be permitted there on Shabbos? And Rav Yosef said, no, he didn't go that far. Not, what's a vineyard path? In other words, that there's a vineyard next to the alleyway, and there's a path through that alleyway. There's a path that opens into the alleyway that goes through the vineyard, presumably to someone's house somewhere else. So it's not a courtyard, it's a vineyard. So there's just a path to some house somewhere that goes through the vineyard and into the alleyway. And Rav Yosef answers Abaye, no. Rabbi Yochanan, very permissive with respect to Eruv and adjusting an alleyway, but not that permissive, not that lenient. He said that a ruin and a courtyard is enough, not a path through a vineyard. And why? Because a ruin is a residence and a vineyard is not a residence. Okay, then Rav Huna bar Chinana says, and Rabbi Yochanan follows his regular line of reasoning. Right, so here, definitely the editors of the Talmud, Ravina and Rav Ashi, are going to take a little bit of a detour to help us understand how Rabbi Yochanan thinks. That's what's important here. They want us to understand how Rabbi Yochanan thinks. Okay, he's lenient. Why is he being lenient? From where is that leniency coming? So they're going to give us a whole other example, which is related. I mean, it's from the laws of Eruv and it's from the laws of carrying on Shabbos, but it's a different matter. And it's actually, we're going to have to hear what this whole discussion was before we come back to what it was, how Rabbi Yochanan ruled in this other discussion, so that we can understand why Rabbi Yochanan is being so permissive here when he says that an alleyway can be adjusted for carrying on Shabbos, even if it only has just a ruin and a courtyard that open into it, contrasting with Shmuel, who says a house and a courtyard, and they contrast with Rav, who said at least 2 courtyards, and each courtyard has to have at least 2 houses in it. Okay, in this other area of the law, we had a Mishna which said that Rabbi Shimon said that vessels which begin at the outset of Shabbos, okay, so when Shabbos begins, if you have certain vessels, what's a vessel? A vessel is like a bowl, something that can contain other things is a vessel, right? A vessel is what a pitcher, a bowl, a plate, a jug, a jar, something that can contain some food or liquid, let's say. Okay, so vessels that are outside when Shabbos begins, right? So normally we think vessels are found inside a house, particularly in a kitchen, but not necessarily. So if a vessel begin at the outset of Shabbos, like tonight, when Shabbos begins on Friday evening, if this vessel was outside, and specifically either in a courtyard or in some kind of an enclosure, some area that was enclosed with partitions, or on a rooftop. So the roof of a house is like a different domain than inside the house, which is kind of interesting. So according to Rabbi Shimon, if there's a vessel that at the beginning of Shabbos is lying outside somewhere, either in a courtyard or in some kind of enclosure or on a roof, then for the rest of Shabbos, it's considered to be in the domain, this loosely defined, the domain of roofs, enclosures, and courtyards. And therefore, those vessels can be carried from one courtyard to another, from one courtyard to a rooftop, from one courtyard to an enclosure. It can't go out into the public domain. You can't carry this thing out into the public domain from a roof, enclosure, or courtyard. But you can carry from roofs to other roofs, from roofs to enclosures, from roofs to courtyards. Any one of these 3 can be, a vessel that starts Shabbos in one of them can be carried into the others. This is irrespective of whether an Eruv was created or not. This is just a leniency of Rabbi Shimon that if some vessel begins outside in one of these 3 kinds of areas, it can be carried to any of the other 3 of these types of areas on Shabbos. That is stated in a Mishna elsewhere. But if the vessel was inside a house when Shabbos began, it cannot be carried out into a courtyard and from that courtyard out into other courtyards. A vessel that starts inside a house is in a different category with respect to Shabbos than a vessel which begins Shabbos outside a house. That's the key ruling of Rabbi Shimon. If it's inside the house, it has a different status than if at the beginning of Shabbos it's outside the house. Okay? And according to Rabbi Shimon, let me just get this exactly right, inside the house, And if the residence did not form an Eruv, right? So the residence, so let's say there's two houses in a courtyard, and the residents of that courtyard who need an Eruv in order to carry things in and out of their houses, from their house to the courtyard, from the courtyard to the house, if they did not establish an Eruv, then vessels may not be carried from the house to the courtyard, right? If there's no Eruv, then for sure stuff that's inside the house can't be carried outside the house. That's the whole ruling, that for an Eruv is necessary. But even though they didn't create an Eruv, something that was already outside the house can be carried from one courtyard to another. That's Rabbi Shimon's ruling. Rav said, the halacha, the law, accords with Rabbi Shimon in the case where there's no Eruv. But if the residents of the courtyard did establish an Eruv so that they can carry things from their house out to the courtyard or from the courtyard into the house, if they did establish an Eruv, then the leniency of Rabbi Shimon, his ruling that you can carry stuff from one courtyard to another, is canceled, according to Rav. Why? Why would you do that? When they did make an Eruv, now they're going to lose, right? See, they had the privilege, let's say, of carrying vessels from one courtyard to another when there was no Eruv. But now that they did make an Eruv so they can carry stuff in and out of their house to the courtyard, why would they lose the privilege of carrying vessels that started Shabbos outside in the courtyard to other courtyards? Reason? Because if they established an Eruv, they might come to carry something from the house out to their courtyard and then from the courtyard to other courtyards. Right, now, this is not a case where they have the larger Eruv, not just within their courtyard, but between their courtyard and other courtyards. Right, that the Rabbi Shimon's leniency that you can carry stuff that started outside on Shabbos from one courtyard to another is where there's no Eruv joining courtyards. Right, that you could still carry something from one courtyard to another if it started Shabbos outside the courtyard. But what Rav is saying is that we're concerned that when they do establish an Eruv in their own courtyard, now they could take an object out of the house into the courtyard, and then they might rely on Rabbi Shimon's leniency to carry that vessel that started Shabbos indoors, inside the house, and now they might use it to carry from one courtyard to another, even though there's no Eruv for that. And that is not permitted. Remember that we have a big, firm distinction between things that began inside the house on Shabbos and things that began Shabbos outside the house. Only the ones that started outside the house can be transferred from one courtyard to another in the absence of the larger, more community-minded Eruv. But so now you understand why Rav says we're concerned that they'll make a mistake. Because of their local little Eruv in their own courtyard, they can carry something from the house out to the courtyard. Once it's outside in the courtyard, they might think that they can rely on Rabbi Shimon's leniency of things that started Shabbos in the court outside to carry it to another courtyard. They can't, because these things didn't start Shabbos outside in the courtyard. They started inside, and using their own little Eruv, they carried it outside on Shabbos, and they're not allowed to carry it to other courtyards. So Rav is being more restrictive for these people when they did make an Eruv, lest they come to make that mistake. But Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, they say the halacha, the law, accords with Rabbi Shimon. You are allowed to take objects that started Shabbos outside in a courtyard to other courtyards. And the law accords with Rabbi Shimon whether or not people made a local Eruv in their own courtyard, because we're not concerned that they will make that mistake. We're gonna empower the people. We're not gonna, just because they made an Eruv, which is good. We want them to make an Eruv so that they can carry stuff in and out of their houses in their own courtyard. But them having done that, we don't want them to lose the benefit of Rabbi Shimon's law that they could carry stuff that started outside from one courtyard to another. And the idea is, well, if they understand that law, then they understand enough that it only applies to vessels that started Shabbos outdoors. It's not going to apply to the ones that started indoors, and we're not going to make a fence around the Torah. We're going to be more lenient than that. And so Rabbi Yochanan in that discussion showed that the sages are not going to make an unnecessary decree that's going to limit people's freedom, even as they're sort of giving them more freedom by having Rabbi Shimon's ruling and their local Eruv. And now we come back to Rabbi Yochanan in the case of when can we adjust an alleyway for carrying, and his ruling was the most permissive of all. Just a ruin and a courtyard that has one house in it is going to be enough to comply with this idea that which alleyways may be adjusted, the ones with courtyards and houses, right? That plural, for him, it's enough, just a ruin, which is like a potential house, and a courtyard that has a house in it. And so here too, this mavoy, this alleyway that contains a ruin, we don't decree against carrying in the alleyway lest they come to carry in the ruin, right? You might think, now the ruin, you can't carry there, right? You can carry in the alleyway, but the ruin does not have its own Eruv because no one lives there, right? So the carrying is going to be possible in the alleyway and in the courtyard that opens to it, where either it's a single residence, just one house in a courtyard, so that you can carry where there's just one house in one courtyard. You don't need an Eruv, you can carry there. Or if there's two houses or more in a courtyard, they need an Eruv, and they would have made an Eruv if they're also going to adjust the alleyway to carry. In the ruin, nobody lives there, so carrying is not going to be permitted in the area of that ruin that opens into the alleyway. Rabbi Yochanan is not going to be so protective, like so strict in saying, well, we're afraid that people who are permitted to now carry in the alleyway will also come to carry in the ruin. Rabbi Yochanan says we don't need to decree against that. We trust the people that far. We don't make a decree in that case. And just as Rabbi Yochanan trusted the people not to take objects from inside their house that started Shabbos inside their house out into their own courtyard and then rely on Rabbi Shimon's ruling to transfer from one courtyard to another in the absence of a community Eruv. Likewise, we're not going to worry that people who come to carry in the alleyway out of their courtyard where there was a local courtyard Eruv, that they would also go further and carry those objects into the ruin where carrying is not permitted. Boom. Shmuel said that, now we saw just now, Shmuel said that an alleyway where there's one house and one courtyard, right, a house that opens directly into the alleyway or right on the alleyway, and a courtyard that just has one house in it, that's enough to adjust, that we can go in, collect some food from the people who live there, put the side post or the crossbeam at the opening of the alley, and now carrying is going to be permitted in the alleyway. That's Shmuel's ruling. Rav, so now we're going into a second incident. All right, so that was the first incident. Here comes the second one. Again, we're going to analyze this and think about what was the sage's original intent, how far did they want to rule, and were they ruling narrowly or broadly? As we saw, Rabbi Yochanan, sought to make broader rulings that would carry a longer way because he had sort of more faith in people to not make silly mistakes, right? That's kind of the way Rabbi Yochanan is being presented to us. All right. Now, Rav Baruna sat and recited this ruling of Shmuel, right? That one house and one courtyard is enough in order to make an alleyway potentially a place where we can adjust it for carrying on Shabbos. So he recited this law, and Rabbi Elazar, who was the student of a Torah academy, we don't know who this Rabbi Elazar is, except that he was probably pretty young and a student, and he said, did Shmuel actually say this? And Rav Baruna said, yes. And so then Rabbi Elazar says, show me where Shmuel lives. So this Rabbi Elazar, he's got some chutzpah, right? He's a young guy, but he's like, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't sound right. So Shmuel is like the Torah authority in this region. He's absolutely the master. Where you go for a ruling is to Shmuel. These rulings are being taught, to Shmuel's students, and their students are teaching it to other students. And this Rabbi Elazar says, I want to meet the big kahuna, right? As it were. I want to meet the big guy. Okay, Rav Baruna shows Rabbi Elazar where Shmuel lives. And this chutzpahdik Rabbi Elazar, right, this young, full of himself type of guy, goes and knocks on the door. Shmuel comes out, the great master, this very, very prominent authority on Torah law, comes outside, says yes. And Rabbi Elazar says, did the master really say that we can, adjust an alleyway for carrying if there's only one house and one courtyard, and that courtyard only has one house in it? And Shmuel says, yes, I said that. And Rabbi Elazar said, well, didn't the master also say elsewhere that with regard to the laws of Eruv, we have to rely on the precise wording of the rulings of earlier sages? And the ruling of the earlier sages was that an alleyway with respect to its courtyards is like a courtyard with respect to its houses, plural, right? And it's like an analogy, right? Like we learned in high school, a dog, I don't know, how do you do this? A dog is to a puppy as a cat is to a kitten, right? That kind of analogy. And likewise, an alleyway is to its courtyards, plural, as a courtyard, singular, is to its houses, plural. And from this we learn that an alleyway, in order for carrying to be permitted there, has to have multiple courtyards and multiple houses. Thank you. Please tell the gentleman that I'm teaching, and I'm not going to be able to speak to him for another 15 minutes, and hopefully he can wait. That's the answer. Thank you. I have a plumber here, and he was supposed to come at 2 o'clock, not at 1 o'clock. And my son was showing me a note what's going on. All right. Okay. So that Rabbi Elazar makes a pretty good argument. Shmuel himself said that the wording of these rulings we have to pay special attention to exactly the way that they're worded. And that ruling was worded with plural and plural. So the question, and so what did Shmuel say to Rabbi Elazar when Rabbi Elazar challenged Shmuel and said, you yourself said that the wording has to be very precise? Shmuel was silent. Shmuel made no answer. Now this comes up in various places in the Talmud, that a sage will be challenged on their ruling, and that they answer with silence. They were silent. Generally speaking, when a sage is challenged by a colleague or by a master, somebody higher than him in the authority chain, or someone of equal stature, if he's challenged and he's silent, it means that he doesn't have a good answer. But when he's challenged by one of his own disciples, or some Johnny-come-lately new disciple, and he gives no answer, it might mean that the challenge is not worth answering. So we don't know what Shmuel's silence means. And the Gemara tries to understand, well, what did Shmuel mean by his silence? And in order for us to understand what Shmuel meant by staying silent, it tells us another incident. So the question is, with his silence, did he accept the rebuke of Rabbi Elazar and change his own ruling? Or by his silence, did he mean, I stand by my ruling and I'm not going to give you an answer? So the Gemara says, Tashema, come and hear. right? So this is often how it introduces a passage where it's going to, help us understand the question that's been asked. Come in here. Tashema. So there was a man named Ivut bar Ihi. And Ivut bar Ihi lived in an alleyway with one house and one courtyard, right? So we've heard that Shmuel says, if there's one house and one courtyard, that's enough. And then you create an Eruv and put up the side post, and then there's going to be carrying permitted on Shabbos in the alleyway. So this man, Ivut bar Ihi, lived in such an alleyway where there was one house and one courtyard. And he erected the side post at the opening of the alleyway and presumably also collected some food for the Eruv basket. And then carrying became permitted in that alleyway, and carrying was permitted in that alleyway for many years. When Shmuel died, right? So and this man Ivut bar Ihi showed that he asked Shmuel for a ruling. Is it permitted to carry in this alleyway? And Shmuel said, yes, it is. So he got a specific consent, he got a specific ruling. It wasn't just a principle that he heard Shmuel say. Shmuel came and visited this alleyway and said, yes, you have one house, you have one courtyard with one house, make sure there's a side post at the opening of the alleyway out to the public domain, and carrying is going to be permitted here on Shabbos. But when Shmuel died many years later, Rav Anan came and he threw the side post down, meaning, no, this alleyway is not a place where it's permitted to carry. This ruling of Shmuel's was erroneous. I didn't do anything about it when Shmuel was alive, but now that Shmuel is dead, we're going to tear down the side post and carrying is not going to be permitted here. Now, Ivut bar Ihi, who lives there, said, hey, I have been carrying in this alley for many years, thanks to a ruling that I received specifically from the mouth of Master Shmuel himself. And now Rav Anan bar Rava comes here and tears down my side post? Like, who do you think you are? You're going to overrule Shmuel's ruling now that he's dead? Who are you to come into my alleyway and tear down my side post where carrying has been permitted all these years thanks to the ruling that we heard from Shmuel's mouth? So the first thing we learn from this story is that carrying in an alleyway with just one house and one courtyard was permitted throughout all of Shmuel's lifetime. So clearly, Shmuel must have not retracted his ruling when this Rabbi Elazar, young upstart, came and challenged him, because it remained in effect till his death. So we can see, okay, so even though Rabbi Elazar said, well, you yourself said it required, because of the wording of the Mishna, plural courtyards, plural houses, that one house and one courtyard is not enough. Obviously, Shmuel did not retract that ruling because carrying remained permitted in this alleyway where Ivut bar Ihi lived all his life. And carrying remained permitted there throughout Shmuel's life. The Gemara says, not so fast. Just because carrying remained permitted in this alleyway throughout Shmuel's life does not prove that Shmuel didn't accept the rebuke of this young Rabbi Elazar and retract his own ruling that one house and one courtyard is enough. How is this possible? Because we learned that another principle, right? Shmuel said that a person's residence is determined by where he sleeps, and Rav said a person's residence is determined by where he eats. Right? So if somebody only sleeps in a place, according to Shmuel, okay, that's a residence. But according to Rav, if somebody only sleeps there but they don't eat there, it is not a residence. A residence is a place where people eat regularly, right? If they're going to have their meal there on Shabbos, it can count as a residence. So in this alleyway where Ivut bar Ihi lived, turns out that there was also a synagogue. Now, a synagogue is not a residence. But there was an attendant of that synagogue who lived somewhere else, but he would come and function as the night watchman of the synagogue. He lived somewhere else, he ate his meals somewhere else, but at night he would come here and sleep in the synagogue. So perhaps Shmuel was aware that in this alleyway there was a synagogue where a person would sleep. And because he slept there, it's like there wasn't just one house and one courtyard. There were actually two houses, right? There was an additional house. And let's say that this was a courtyard, right? The synagogue had a courtyard. So there were actually two courtyards, not just one courtyard. And so perhaps Shmuel did retract his ruling that multiple courtyards are necessary. But here there were, in fact, multiple courtyards. And then after Shmuel died, Shmuel had been following his own reasoning, but as we learned, the law, the halacha, follows Rav, who says that a residence is where a place eats, is where a person eats. And who was it that came and tore down this side post after Shmuel died? It was Rav Anan bar Rav, the son of Rav. So presumably he follows the ruling of his father, Rav, that a residence is where a person eats. This synagogue attendant was not eating in the synagogue. Therefore, we only have one house and one courtyard. It's not enough. You can't carry there. And I think Rav Anan might have been a little bit more politic. He might have been a little bit smoother and more elegant and kinder about this discussion. Rather, he might have talked to Ivut bar Ihi about where his ruling is coming from and not just torn down the side post. But at any rate, what we've seen is that the sages, in order to understand, right, like they don't have this full record of the, all of the, the disputations, like they don't have all of the back and forth. They don't have every kind of, they weren't there when the conversations were had, 100 or 200 or 400 years earlier. So just based on the conversations that were recorded and that were memorized and entered the oral tradition, they're trying to figure out, what were the earlier sages intending? How did they arrive at their ruling? And can we apply it in this situation? All right, let's check comments and questions before I go speak to my plumber. Pam Simmons, Sal, this is what I was wondering. How often did rulings get tossed aside when the originator of the rule dies? I think the fact that somebody dies is never a reason to toss aside a ruling. But what you might have is that, you had Tanaim, right? So the earlier sages, the sages of the Mishna, they were kind of all colleagues with each other. And generally speaking, you would have situations where one sage would go one way, would make a ruling, would argue this, and another sage would argue that. And then maybe they would have a vote among the greater group of the sages, and so they would follow the ruling of one of them, and the other was recorded as a minority opinion. But even though it was a minority opinion, there were cases where in the area where the guy who had the minority opinion was the local authority, people there would still follow his ruling because it was his ruling and he was their guy in their local area, whereas everyone else would go the other way. And then once he died, then the law would become more universal, like that town would end up going like along with everybody else. Sometimes there was actually like a majority, but the ruling would get extended because, they would go with the minority for a while because it was such a prominent person who held that position. And again, once he died, then they'll go, all right, now we're just going to go with the majority. So these are the kinds of situations that could come up. Generally speaking, we wouldn't, toss out a ruling just because someone died. They're trying to, the idea is that they do establish precedents that outlive them for sure. And, and that's in the period of the Mishna, that the Tanaim, and then the Amoraim are the rabbis of the Gemara, the rabbis of the Talmud. They're considered to be at a lower level of authority than the earlier sages. And then once we get past the period of the Talmud, in the 6th century, so then we're getting into the Geonim, right? So the later commentators still, and they are definitely less stature, less authority than the ones that come before. That's a general principle, if you're with us for the first time, that, sort of contrary to the way modern society thinks that, well, newer is always better, there's more science, more knowledge, more technology, so a ruling made today is going to have more authority than one, made 20 years ago. But the sages understood that the time of maximum clarity about God's will, and all these laws are based on commandments in the Torah, therefore God's will, how we should conduct our lives. Well, the maximum clarity that we had in the world about what God wants us to do or not do was when God revealed God's self at Mount Sinai and gave the Torah. And so the closer we are to that moment, the more revelation is in the world, the more truth and understanding there was. And as we get further away from it, less, right? So each generation actually has a little bit less authority. On the other hand, situations are coming up in the world that didn't exist at earlier times. So of course there has to be an authority in every age. But to overturn, a later sage might say we will extend that principle into this new area or we won't. But to actually overturn an already existing law, very rare, very rare, very rare indeed. Sharon said, if a vessel is needed to carry water from a well in the courtyard in and out of the house, and it is left outside, so to go in and out of the house, right, we need the Eruv. We got to have, first of all, if it's a single family house in a single courtyard, they don't need an Eruv. They can carry things in and out. That's fine. If there's multiple houses, they need the Eruv in order to carry things in and out of the house. So to carry water in the bucket, right, from the well outside into the house, if there's multiple houses in that courtyard, they need to have the Eruv established. But even without an Eruv, what we're learning is they could carry water, from that, and well, the fact that the well itself is its own separate private domain is a different question. But let's say there's just some water in that bucket, or you want to take the bucket over to the next courtyard over. Even without an Eruv, they can do that because the bucket started outside on the beginning of Shabbos. So it can go courtyard to courtyard. And Francine said, did you still do burnt offerings on Yom Kippur or any other time? And Spencer answered, thank you. No burnt offerings have been made since the destruction of the second temple. Exactly. So many of these laws, like Eruv does still exist. We do still need that law. Carrying is still prohibited on Shabbos. But bringing offerings on the altar has not been possible since the second temple was destroyed. And that not only animal sacrifices, right? There were also meal offerings and wine libations and water libations at certain times of the year. There was the incense offering, and none of that has been possible in about 2,000 years. But even though we can't bring those offerings, the way that we fulfill our obligation, because it's a Torah obligation to bring a daily offering and an additional offering on Shabbos. So the Torah says to do it. We're incapable of doing it when there's no temple and no altar and the high priests aren't serving in Jerusalem. So how do we fulfill our obligation? By studying those laws. And so if you look in a Jewish prayer book, at the beginning of every Jewish prayer book, you have, certainly in every Orthodox Jewish prayer book, I think even in the Reform and Conservative movements, I'm not sure, but in any traditional Jewish prayer book, at the beginning of the daily prayers, you actually have all the laws listed of the daily offerings. Not everybody reads all the laws of the daily offerings every day. And you can kind of understand that because that was a communal offering, right? It wasn't like everyone in the nation was involved in that. The priests who were serving in the temple would bring those offerings on behalf of the nation. Individual offerings were like peace offerings, guilt offerings, sin offerings that people would bring at certain times in their lives. And that's not possible. And those kinds of practices have been replaced a lot more by prayer and by blessings, right? The laws of blessings and the fact that whenever we benefit from this world, we say a blessing. We thank God and bless God for giving us, liquids to drink and foods to eat and beautiful aromas to smell and, the love and health of our families, etc. A Jew is commanded to bless God 100 times a day if possible. Okay. And Lynn over in Texas says, I love the reason that Shmuel ruled on the alley was due to the sleeping habits of the attendant of the synagogue, and it changed when the attendant in the synagogue stopped sleeping in the synagogue after Shmuel died, and only then did Rav Anan take down the side post. Right, when there was that status change. Right, so that's a little unclear. The Gemara seems to indicate that, but that's not totally clear whether he just took it down because Shmuel died, or after Shmuel died and the attendant stopped sleeping in the shul, in the synagogue, which was, according to Shmuel, what determined that it was a residence. Right? Okay, so that's what I've got for us today. It's been great learning with you guys. You should have such a beautiful and blessed Shabbos. When Shabbos comes in tonight, it should be peaceful. It should be nice. And remember, I think in 2 weeks is the Shabbos Project, where Jews around the world who even ordinarily are not so Shabbos observant, people are joining everywhere. Thousands and thousands, maybe millions of people, millions of Jews are going to try to keep Shabbos with all its rules for just one Shabbos. That's the Shabbos Project, and we're partnering with the Shabbos Project to help get the word out. And on that Thursday before that Shabbos, so not in 1 week, but 2 weeks from yesterday, Nina's going to be doing a live show and teaching how she makes challah for Shabbos. And I can tell you, Nina's challah is it's so good. So even if you make challah already, it wouldn't be the worst thing to see how Nina makes hers. And if you haven't made challah before, you definitely want to see how Nina makes hers. And that's even going to be a community, because when Nina makes challah and she's kneading the dough, she's also sort of praying for various things like the health of her family. And so when she's kneading the dough at that stage in that show, I'm going to be behind the camera and people can sort of put their prayers in the comments, and we'll all pray as a community as we're making the challah together, as it were. The Shabbos Project, definitely something to look forward to in a couple